rather sort of typical European experience, in the sense that there were points where you wondered whether we were ever going to reach agreement. But in a very European way, suddenly everything came together at the last minute. And I think we've ended up with a reasonable report. I think one of the reasons why for that experience, particularly in the middle of the process, was not just because these things are much, much more easy to do face to face, and we had to start doing things with webinars with 40 or 50 people on a webinar, but also because it was a very diverse group of people. But I think that was actually one of its strengths, because we had a huge different areas of expertise. And I hope that that's going to help in the whole process for the Commission, because there was good discussion. There were lots of background papers produced, so there's an awful lot more paper around than just the 124 or whatever it is pages of the report itself. I think there were a lot of proposals. There are 17 recommendations, but even within each of those 17 recommendations, there are a lot of sub recommendations. And I think that reflects the very fact that there isn't a single silver bullet, which is the answer to CMU. There were moments when we discussed whether we should rank the proposals. We, in the end, decided not to, because they were very diverse, very different, some very technical, some very aspirational. And I think we'd have been there another 6 months if we tried to rank them, because some people would have wanted to push their own particular issues. As far as how the group worked, we were divided into 3 subgroups, and Alexandra and I were on the subgroup which was looking at retail participation, and Ed was on the group that was looking at raising capital. And there was also a group on market infrastructure. All I just wanted to say in terms of the dynamic, it actually really pleased me that we were looking not just at market infrastructure and capital raising, which are the traditional areas that have been looked at in the context of CMU, but also that we were talking about participation. Although we were it was called retail participation, the reality is that it was both direct and indirect through pensions, through institutional investment. And the only other thing I wanted to mention was how the dynamic changed in the whole process. The initial impetus behind all of this, a lot of this, was Brexit and the fact that the largest capital market in Europe was no longer going to be part of the EU. But it's very interesting that you'll note in the final report that there's hardly mention of Brexit. And it was COVID-19 that therefore became very much the focus of attention. Ed, you were on a different group from the rest of us. You know, I just wondered whether you had any further thoughts about the dynamics of the group.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think from our perspective, we had, you know, an excellent chair in David Wright, who really sort of marshaled respectfully the different stakeholders. As Sheila, as you mentioned, we had, you know, good diversification, both from representatives of the asset management community, the banking union, issuers, to sort of come and tackle around these topics. It's interesting because on the face of it, you never thought we'd end up with 17 recommendations. We always thought, you know, when the first meeting, we thought, right, we're going to have 5, maybe 7, because we thought that that was what was, you know, reasonable to produce in a report. But I think that actually the unifying, for me, there were three unifying themes around these recommendations. And for those of you that, read the report for the first time or go back to it, it's clear that, every segment talks to one of these three themes. The first is around, just promoting greater simplicity. So some of the measures to lower the barriers to entry for companies to come to the market, for example, the recommendations around single access points. The second real, for me, the tenet that kind of binds all these recommendations is really around competition and democratization of access. So this is about creating competition for capital to be, providing financing to companies in Europe. And then the last is really, something that has long been talked about, but is really important is, we need to double down on creating an equity culture across Europe, especially in this low rate environment, and especially now given COVID, many people of a certain age will never see rising rates again. And that's going to have profound implications for them in terms of asset planning and retirement planning, and we need to, increase the access of these kinds of instruments into more hands, and I think also increase a culture of owning equity, which I think is, in many of the European jurisdictions is really devoid. I mean, Alex, I don't know what your perspectives were. Handing over to you.
Yes, and thank you, Ed. Since I have been a member of the same subgroup as Sheila, all I would like to add for the start is really that we had basically all ESAs as observers. Some of them in the subgroups, like Stephen Major was a member of our group. We had European institutions like the European Investment Bank and others at the table. So quite a diverse group of market participants, supervisory organizations or institutions, and basically all stakeholders of capital markets.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, Tanguy, that I think as a result of that, inevitably there were some compromises that had to be made. But I think the general spirit of the group was very much not necessarily pursuing one's own particular hobby horse. There was an element of that, of course, but the overall spirit of the group was actually one of trying to do the best for European capital markets and to actually bring our expertise to that and our experience and background.
Sheila, were these recommendations put to the vote at the end? I mean, is there full consensus of all 28 participants? And then, Alexander, you mentioned the ESAs being observers. They simply observed and remained silent? Or because I was under the impression that some of the ESAs were quite active behind the scenes on some topics.
Yes, right. So, Tanguy, I mean, you see our smile, at least those who can watch us. I mean, they were very active observers, let's put it that way. I mean, according to the rules of procedures, they were not supposed to influence, let's say, the proposals and the like, but they have been very active in the discussions, and that might have also led to some extent to the outcome. Yeah.
And did you vote at the end?
Yeah, on the point about voting, no, we didn't vote. I mean, whenever possible, we reached consensus, which means that there might have been one or two occasions when, as I say, there was a certain amount of give and take required on all sides. And I mean, I think the correct decision was made that where there were areas of disagreement, we surfaced those, and we were very transparent about where those areas of disagreement were. So I think some of them are fairly obvious. Clearly, the debate around supervision, that wasn't an area where we could reach full agreement. The issues around inducements, we rehearsed in the report the arguments for and against. And I think that actually helped the report because I think it it enabled there to be debate, it enabled clarity, and it anticipates, I think, I hope helps the Commission anticipate the sort of political issues that might arise in any sort of future negotiation that take around any proposals that they might make.
No, we know that this report is the report of the high-level forum, not of the Commission, but yet when it comes to the European Commission, I mean, was it mainly led by DG FISMA, or did you get the sense that TaxSud or Justice or Envy or other DGs were also part of the group? Because eventually there will need to be strong buy-in of not only Beringen, but also all the other DGs and the commissioners. So which DG, apart from FISMA, was involved in that work, if any?
I don't know if you're asking me. I mean, it was mainly DG FISMA.
Yeah. As far as that we are aware of, right?
Yeah.
But all proposals, or as we call it, fiches, by the subgroups were put to plenary. So basically, there had to be an agreement among the 28 members of the high-level forum on the proposals that basically made it to the final report.
Yeah, and there was a lot of refinement of, you know, as I said, it's not so much there was out disagreements, but there was, you know, a lot of debate in one part about the depth of the, you know, when you look at technical elements like securitization, you know, how far down do you go into that topic? And as I said, there was a pretty open environment to be able to sort of comment or to, you know, add perspectives to some of the existing sort of features. And obviously there were more ideas than there are features, and so certain things were dropped, maybe because of a lack of consensus, maybe because of a lack of materiality around, you know, whether things were deemed game changers or, you know, really in keeping with some of the sort of fundamental tenets that we thought were important that unified that report. So it was quite iterative.
Yeah.
So no, participants on the line are free to send me their questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please do so, awaiting your questions. One question to all three of you. What about the composition of the group? I mean, it was quite surprising to see so many exchanges and so few institutional investors. I think we had 1 or 2 pension funds, only 1 insurance company. I mean, did the Commission get this right? I mean, at the end of the day, you know, it is the institutional investors that will make a difference more than anyone else. Any views on that?
Look, I think to echo Sheila's point, people came with their own domain expertise, but it's not like we had, you know, representations from banks and they were suddenly, you know, massively advocating for defending the banking union or their interests. I think that it was for me, and I, as I said, I don't. This is you know, I'm more committed, more of a practitioner rather than a policy advisor. It was remarkable how unpartisan people were around, you know, the orientation of the organization, and it's also, remember, you know, in the terms of reference, we were essentially representing this group as private individuals, and obviously availing ourselves of the infrastructure that we had in the organizations that we represent and the expertise we could bring to bear. But I think that was a very, you know, important point that was highlighted relatively early by the chairs in setting the tone of how we collaborated.
And I think, I mean, I would also add that it wasn't weight of numbers that mattered. It was, you know, if you had expertise, you were listened to. So it didn't matter that there was only 1 insurance company or 1 asset owner, because you know, we didn't vote on anything. And if you had a interesting point of view, you were listened to, and, you know, everybody on the group was strong enough. There were no shrinking violets on the group. So if we wanted to weigh in, we didn't hold back.
So now we don't hear you, Tanguy. You seem to be
Alex, no, I was asking whether you have any final comments to make before we move on the group dynamics. Maybe
I think that's fine. I think we should move on to the real issues now.
Yeah, absolutely. So we move on, and I would like now to hand over to Ed, looking at the perspective of the issuers, so financing businesses, and also that of the institutional investors. Ed, over to you.
Yeah. So look, I think, you know, it's obvious to probably many of you on the call that have followed CMU for several years, but I think it's worth repeating is that, you know, why is the thriving capital markets union in Europe so important? And we also have to recognize the starting point. You know, we have a very different market structure to the one that we have, let's say, in the United States. 80% bank funded versus, you know, the US, which is really much 75% funded in the capital markets. Now that's not a bad thing, and I think all too often people sort of compare and contrast the banking union and the capital markets union. I think that is a false dichotomy. The one challenge I did talk about is, you know, we are predominantly debt financed in Europe, and that has certain limitations around fostering growth. And we all recognize that there is, you know, some missing steps of that funding escalator in, you know, really enabling companies to grow. So we're actually on par in relative terms to the UK, to the US, when you normalize for GDP and employment at creating companies. It's just the scaling of those companies through that journey where, you know, there's a very significant funding gap. And then there's the last point, which I mentioned around increasing the competition for capital. And that's a really important tenet to driving a thriving ecosystem for fostering company growth in Europe. A lot of this centers on, you know, the small and medium enterprises, the research intensive industries, the places where innovation and R&D is critical to fostering growth. And you can only see how different economies have adapted different models to varying degrees of success. But that is, you know, as I say, why it's such an important fundamental tenet of bringing Europe together. The other thing as well is I think it's really interesting, as Sheila mentioned, we were, you know, COVID was breaking through this, and it you know, as we were all sort of dealing with, you know, processing the human tragedy, the implications for the capital markets, it was very reassuring to see that actually that the banking union and the capital markets worked very well in step one another. So banks traditionally play this role of being a lender of first resort, an immediacy of liquidity, and they obviously, you know, thanks to a lot of the reforms that the EBA put in with the countercyclical buffers from the last crisis, they're in a much better position to play that role. And what a company does is it goes and draws a line with a bank, and then orientates itself to the capital markets to then term out those liabilities, which releases that capital back to the bank that they can then, you know, relend that money to another organization. And we saw, you know, investment grade issuance, you know, in the crisis was running at 230% of in Europe of the monthly run rate in 2019. So whilst banks were not increasing their balance sheets massively, they were, as I say, important velocity of circulators of capital at the front end, and then the capital markets was playing its role at the longer term end. And I think that again exemplifies the symbiotic relationship that exists between a banking union and a capital markets union, be it as an originate to distribute function and as a manager of long-term liabilities. The challenge is that, you know, that works well at the blue cap end of the market, sorry, blue chip end of the market. It works less well in the SME space because it's less well intermediated. The depth of liquidity is lower. And obviously, as we've seen from a lot of these support schemes that have been put in place, it is really looking to tackle that part of the market. And so that's, I think, why we really have to think about it from an issuer perspective. You know, this is why we're thinking about, as I say, improving the ecosystem, so lowering the barriers to entry for companies, for smaller companies to be able to access the public markets, for it to be valuable for them to access the public markets. It's not just about listing, it's about them fostering their growth ambitions through being a public company, having an acquisition currency. And then, you know, important things like, as I say, I'll just touch briefly on is, you know, the changes to securitization. Again, it talks to that relationship. banks are key originators, and things like securitization are a very good way of syndicating or transferring risk broadly into the market. And we recognize that for the CMU, for the capital markets to succeed, the banking union also needed to succeed as well in that. So there are some sort of very preliminary perspectives from an issuer's perspective, but happy to turn over to Sheila and Alex for other views.
Yeah, please go ahead, Sheila.
I mean, for me, the interesting thing is that there were quite a lot of proposals around lessening the burden for smaller companies, making the requirements slightly less onerous from the corporate perspective. But I think the test will be in the extent to which we as investors are comfortable with that. So there was a debate, for example, in one of the fiches, there's a reference to dual voting structures. And there were those who were saying dual voting structures are a great thing because it enables smaller companies, it enables the founders of smaller companies to maintain control. But I think as asset managers, we were also keen to point out that actually dual voting structures prevent us from exercising our governance responsibilities and so on. So there is still, I think that there's an interesting discussion still to be had, and I think that's probably going forwards one of the areas that we might want to have a look at as a farmer, is that balance between the information that we need to make investment decisions and the information that companies offer. But Alexander.
Yeah, let me add to both of you. I think what was also important to understand and recall is that basically all of us have been caught by COVID-19 in the midst of our term, with regard in particular to the high volatility in capital markets after the second week of March. And I think during this period, first of all, the existing European regulation and infrastructure and also asset managers prove that they can survive even such turmoil or high volatility compared to 2008, to the 2008 crisis. On top of that, I think that it has, as Sheila said in the very beginning, a tremendous impact on our discussions, because some of the proposals would not have, let's say, received such a support without COVID-19 and its impact on European economies and capital markets. Like SME financing, for example. I mean, most of you in the call will recall our discussions a few years ago on LTIF regulation, which is still, from my point of view, a dead animal. But there has been a lot of proposals now how to, let's say, to revive that regulation, to make it really worth investing and setting up an LTIF fund and other examples. So I think, as always in life, this negative impact of COVID had some positive on the discussions as well.
What about the single access point? I mean, how it seems hugely ambitious. Are you confident that this can come to life anytime soon? I mean, it's we have been talking about this for so many years. There seems to be consensus at the level of the high-level forum. What will be needed to make it a success going forward?
You mean in general to make CMU 2.0?
No, well, yeah. to make the single access point a success, a reality, because it's so massive. How do you get there?
Look, I think it's sorry, as you can see, my 3-year-old is also wanting to participate in the call.
Your 3-year-old is going to achieve that one day.
Yeah.
Maybe you get them talking about consolidating.
What is the timeline? Yes.
Yeah. Look, I think, yes, it is ambitious, but I think it's also important to recognize, Tanguy, the reality is, you have a lot of feedback from issuers at the small end of the market who are sitting there saying, I get very little benefit from being listed. I actually get a lot of cost burden and I don't get the supposed benefits of this. And the simple reality is that, you know, over the last 15 years, you've seen phenomenal fee compression in, asset management fees in active strategies. And it becomes increasingly unviable to run small and mid-cap mandates and to run them well with based on a traditional form of investing. And I'm not trying to make a controversial statement as to the future of asset management, but I'm just drawing on the realities that in all our processes on the asset management side, we've had to embrace a more systematic use of data to be able to, give just a sharper investment insight and, a strong investment process, but to make that much more scalable. And the ambition of something like the single access point is really to create the benefit that the US has in terms of being able to incite the private sector to, in asset managers and more broadly, investment management firms, to be able to build portfolios in a different way, leveraging, this uniform data. And that's not a view on active versus passive in any way. It's really a view on recognizing that we need a heterogeneity in the supply of capital at the small end of the market, the small and mid end of the market. And this is a really important way for empowering people to, to look at that. A central tenet of the toolkit of being able to evaluate companies of that size.
Thank you. We have questions about investment research for small and mid caps. I mean, what about that in the report? What are the recommendations? And is it a step backward? Is it something that you welcome?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It was discussed at length. And maybe that was one of the ones that, didn't quite make it over the line, not because I don't think there was any consensus around that, but I think we also recognize that there are costs associated with the production of that report, and it's like, who bears that cost? And then there was a broader question of saying, like, is this really the premise of the high-level forum to take a view, given that MiFID is already being reviewed, and that there's already quite a strong voice around small and mid-cap research. My point is that whether it's done by third parties or whether it's done in the form of primary research, unifying the data definitely lowers the cost for third-party providers or for primary providers of research to be able to do that work. So indirectly, I think it does address that point around independent research.
Thank you, Ed. We have another question on the role of the national central banks, and was it ever discussed, as a market participant in the forum? Any reference to that in your discussions?
I'm trying to think about, the central bank's playing a pretty important role in hoovering up assets in the capital markets, that's for sure.
There's no changing role.
No, there was no, let's say, intense discussions about, let's say, monetary policy or the QE activities of the ECB. The discussions ranked more on supervision, really. The conversion between NCAs and the way they implement regulation and basically ESMA or IOPA.
Another question on LTIF. You mentioned it was a dead animal. Any hope to revive it at some point? How ambitious are those recommendations? Do you feel that it will get traction with the member states and that we will end up with a very successful LTIF vehicle?
Tanguy, in German, we would say the worm has to taste the fish. I don't know whether that is the right translation into English. But that regulation will only attract investors if you provide, let's say, the flexibility, in particular for institutional investors, and certain advantages to really invest into infrastructure on one hand, and the other one is SMEs. But quite frankly, as it stands today, you don't need the LTIF regulation. As an institutional investor, you can either invest directly or through AIFs into infrastructure. Same with regard to SMEs.
And I think one of the sorry, Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I would make a slightly more Anglo-Saxon reference in the film Wayne's World, build it and they will come. And I think that, you know, Alex is totally right. I think the original ambition of the LTIF framework, I think, was actually way ahead of its time. But let's just reset and look at the realities. So we're now living in a low rate environment for much longer. Yield is a very scarce commodity and difficult to get hold of. We've experienced a lot of near misses and scandals with managers putting in illiquid instruments into UCITS funds and that meeting with some unfortunate circumstances. And then lastly, there is a huge demand for private markets. To some of the points that I was talking about is that, the access to that is, to Alex's point, fine if you can invest as an institutional investor, but it's really not democratized for access to retail investors. So I think that the recommendations of putting LTIF back on the table were scrutinized because, they haven't been successful as part of the last recommendations in the form of the number of funds that are now created as a result of the legislation. But I think that there are some very specific recommendations around, the passporting into different jurisdictions, some of the ambiguity around how such an instrument, because it was deemed investing in illiquid or private securities, was essentially deemed sophisticated, even though that the fund wrapper actually afforded a certain amount of these safeguards of dealing with illiquid assets. And lastly, I think that we hadn't been as explicit in terms of saying that we see this as actually a listed instrument, and so therefore there is a secondary liquidity that can be garnered through someone that doesn't have to make a 7-year commitment to lock up capital. So I do think the changes were born by the intelligence that we gathered as to why it hasn't been as successful, and I think it's much more to do with the distribution rather than the what it is actually set to do. Now we're now undergoing, a huge governments around Europe are going to go into a huge period of fiscal expansion. They're going to need the private sector participation. We know that infrastructure is something that is, top of mind on lots of people's agenda from a political perspective. And then also, I think that something like LTIF addresses, some of these issues that we have around sustainability. So if you're going to own a building for 40 years, you're very minded about, the impact of erosion or global warming or lots of these issues that, if you were going to own that building for a year. So long-term investing and sustainability are inextricably linked. And I think that's another important segment of why LTIF features so prominently in the report, because obviously there is now a renewed focus by the Commission on sustainability. Sorry, I was a bit of a monologue there, but there we go. Sheila, I'm sure you have your perspectives as well.
No, my only point was actually, I think it was the point that you make about the listing and the development of a secondary market. And I think, there will, the LTIF is also coming to the fore more as Ed rightly says, as we're talking about UCITS and open-ended funds investing in illiquid assets and so on. So I think there will be interest in the LTIF.
We have a few more questions, so I suggest we cover those and then we can move to the next chapter. So question 1, not much in the report about the need for a post-trade consolidated tape. How come? Any views?
It's another one for Ed, I think.
Ed.
as you can imagine, there are certain parties that, look, objectively, the questions that were asked is, if you build this data lake, how's it going to be used, and who's going to pay for it? And I think those are important questions, and the various agencies where we did spend some time around what the implementation model would be, how that could be valuable, especially to provide transparency to the end investors. And for us, as asset managers, we're all about evidencing, all these things that we do in day in, day out, like best execution, helping understand, the most efficient pathway to transacting. And a consolidated tape is a critical component of that. As I mentioned, there were 17 recommendations. This was definitely one that maybe rightly or wrongly got left on the cutting room floor. There were advocates for, there were advocates against. It was discussed, as I said, in the plenary sessions. And I think we recognize that we couldn't have put everything in there, but it was definitely talked about. So it's not like we sort of glossed over it.
Other question, let me read it out for you. What would the panelists consider to be success in terms of what happens next in terms of the report's recommendations? For example, are some of the recommendations so critical that failure for them to gain traction would call into question the value of the high-level forum? So we know that Thomas Wieser said, that they are all interdependent, mutually reinforcing, but in your view, are some of those recommendations more important than others, and failure for them to get any traction would then question the value of the entire exercise?
Yeah, from my point of view, there are a number of quick wins in the recommendations that could easily be implemented, and there are some really long-term shots. Because in particular with regard to certain recommendations, the Commission itself has only limited power, basically. Just consider the whole aspect of taxes. We were talking about withholding tax, double taxation agreements in the forum. We were talking about the treatment of pensions in the different countries, etc. These are initiatives where basically the Commission can become active, but you need basically the European, the national governments actually to implement and support it. So you need a trialogue basically of the three institutions.
Okay.
And there are definitely some other aspects or recommendations, as I said, which you can easily implement. We were also talking about, in our subgroup, about retail investor capital market illiteracy or literacy, and what has to be done. We were talking about pension funds, even the establishment of national pension funds. That is only an initiative that could be recommended by the Commission to national governments. We were talking about establishing dashboards to monitor the efforts of the European governments to further develop their pension system. We were discussing, and there are a number of examples already existing in Europe, how to provide more information for the individual European household on their pension, or in general, not only pensions, first and second pillar, but their whole retirement wealth, basically, and so on and so on.
Thank you, Alex. Maybe final question before we move to the next section. Some participants in this call wonder why so little reference is made to sustainable finance throughout the report. Do you agree with this assessment? And if so, is there any specific reason?
I'm happy to start responding to that one. Yes, I mean, interestingly, there was a debate at the beginning as to whether we'd have a separate work stream on sustainable finance. And we decided no, we didn't want sustainable finance to be considered to be something over there, separate from everything else, that sustainable finance needed to run through all our thinking. But I think, and then we're very clear that sustainable finance was very much at the, and not actually just green, that particularly the COVID-19 is now bringing into focus other aspects of the ES and G, particularly the S. And that was something that developed over time. But I think probably one of the reasons why they're on, I mean, we were focusing on we were urged and wanted to focus on very specific recommendations. And we were very aware of all the other things that were going on sustainable finance. So didn't really feel that we wanted to cut across all the other work that was happening. And I don't think colleagues would have been too happy with us if we'd said, oh, and here's another six recommendations around sustainable finance when we've got so much coming at us on the subject. But it was always there.
Yeah,
thank you, Sheila.
I couldn't agree more with Sheila. Just allow me to add, I mean, we just had the expert group on sustainable finance. It wouldn't have made no sense at all to copy their work. I mean, we have the EU action plan. We have certain initiatives already implemented in a time which nobody of us or at EFAMA has experienced before. Within 2 years, we have seen regulation now. Let this first work. And although it has been present, it wouldn't have made sense really to put something on top of that.
Thank you, Alex. So moving on to the retail investors' perspective. Alex, do you want to kickstart the discussion?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, as we said in the beginning, Sheila and I were members of the retail participation in capital markets. And there were, in particular, I think for the asset management industry and participants in this call, as I mentioned earlier, 3 important topics that have been discussed in length. And I don't want to repeat what is in the report, but I would like to highlight and ask Sheila to add as well to complement my statements. I would also like to highlight a little bit the different point of views among the members, in particular in the subgroup, but also in the plenary, because I consider this important, in particular for the asset management industry, if we move forward. Let's first of all, I mean, talk about illiteracy or the ability of retail investors to understand macro and microeconomic developments and capital markets. Because we all believed, and this was common sense, that if the European retail investors would have a higher degree of understanding about capital markets, their participation in capital markets will definitely be much higher than today. And on the basis of demographics, pension gaps, etc., we all considered it extremely important that we increase the participation of retail investors in capital markets, either through direct investment or through investment funds or other instruments. But quite frankly, there have been surprisingly 2 totally opposite positions. We have had the representatives of NGOs in the discussions. They would have basically said, rather no investment than bad advice. And we had, on the other hand, quite a number of representatives, not only from the asset management industry, but also from other financial institutions, saying we have to put more emphasis on financial education. We have to recommend through the Commission to local governments to implement financial education into the school systems already, into their educational program. And I mean, all I wanted to show is that there has been quite a difference in opinion, how to tackle this issue. And maybe Sheila, you like to add something to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd be very happy to add, and I think an element of it, the reason why we were getting pushback from some of the consumer organisations was there was a sort of suggestion that we were pushing for this financial literacy agenda in order to blame the consumer and sort of take responsibility, put responsibility on them rather than on ourselves. And I think we were at pains to explain that that was not the case, that we felt that that actually the reason why we were wanting people to feel more comfortable about just talking about money was in order to feel that they could engage with financial advisors. I sometimes say that, I think some people feel that going and talking to a financial advisor is like the first time you go to a wine tasting and you really don't know, you don't speak the language. So I think this is about giving people, we were trying to make it clear that this was about giving people the skills actually to push back and to empower themselves in this process, rather than sort of pushing responsibility away from ourselves and towards the investors. And we were very, very happy to say, look, we do need to improve the way we communicate with investors. We do sometimes talk in jargon, and we acknowledged that. And I think we were also very keen to point out that it's not just about financial education. It's about engagement at points in life when it's important. So we talked about financial MOTs, for example, catching people at important points in their lives and giving them appropriate nudges. So I think some of that was captured in the report, but there was quite a lot of very, very good discussion about that kind of thing.
I have two questions here. One on the value statement. So in the UK, I think there is this requirement from the FCA that asset managers every year then produce a value statement. Was that ever mentioned in the forum discussions? And is there a risk that it ends up being also applied or used in EU 27 going forward? Any views on that?
Sheila was our UK expert, our guest from the UK.
We didn't get into granular issues like that. No, I mean, there were references to costs and charges, and there was quite a lot of talk about comparison tables and being able, being transparent about costs and charges. But no, there was no discussion about quite in that sort of detail. It was a much broader discussion that we were having.
And another question just received relates to open finance.
Yeah.
Sheila, can you tell us more about this?
I'll tell you a bit about this. This was a new subject to me, and the dynamics of the group is that you've expressed an interest in something. And you found yourself on a subgroup drafting papers. You have to be very careful about opening your map sometimes. So I did get involved in the discussion on open finance. And generally we linked that to the question of, I mean, although there was reference to open banking, and there was inspiration taken from open banking, I think it was recognized that this is not, we were not talking about transactions in terms of open finance. And we were trying to take a step-by-step approach. And we saw the benefit of open finance being around being able to gather, Alexander made reference to being able to develop a financial plan. I think one of the other strings of debate that we had was that we were trying to convey to those who would listen to us that, people don't wake up in the morning and reach for a comparison table and say, well, am I going to buy an Union fund today, or am I going to buy a Schroders one or a BlackRock one? They need support. They need to, and that actually investment needs to be seen as part of a financial plan. So it links in with the point that we were talking about consolidating in one place all the information that you have from your different providers. And often if you go to an advisor or a financial planner nowadays, they have to spend quite a lot of time going through your filing cabinet or contacting all the different providers of your financial products. And a lot of them are in different places. So what we were talking about was putting them in one place to help that advice process. Maybe less acute in some European countries where most of your financial transactions are done through one institution, through your bank, but certainly in countries where it's more fragmented. I think this is an important aspect and also might encourage more third-party provision. And on the flip side of it, which we were very supportive of, was the consumer organisations were very keen to ensure that the data is mine and that it is for me to decide what happens to that data. So there was some discussion about whether we should include non-financial data in this and of social media and so on. And so no, let's limit it at this stage to hard financial data. It's one of the more open issues. It's probably less developed than some of the other discussions, but fits well with the whole question about technology and support of technology. And so I think it's something that it would be very interesting to take forward.
Thank you. We have many questions on inducement. Is it Alex or Sheila?
Both of us.
Do you want to start on this one?
Yeah, let me start on this one, and then the expert from the UK comes and either supports me or whatever. I mean, as you can imagine, there has been quite a controversial discussion about inducements. And first, let us step back a bit. I mean, in all continental Europe, or in most countries, except maybe in the Netherlands and in the past also in the UK, definitely, except these two countries, we have basically fee-based systems, meaning that the distributors, being it banks or insurance companies or others, benefit from retrocessions paid by the producers of those products. And there has definitely a discussion that this should be banned. That was really the start of the discussion. In particular, supported by not only the consumer protectionists, but also, for example, ESMA and IOPA. We ended up, as you can tell, basically with a kind of compromise or a better understanding, because we really had intense discussions about this topic. And we have discussed in particular the pro and cons of alternative systems, basically those which are present in the UK and their impact. And that's why I would like to refer to Sheila in a moment, but also those in the Netherlands. And at least from my point of view, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm still a strong believer. Only if our clients, and now I'm talking about the asset management industry, are happy with the products and advice they receive, our business is going to grow. I don't believe that in the long run you can survive as a business if your clients are not satisfied, because there are so many alternatives. But maybe Sheila, you can complement from your point of view and experience in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, it may well be that many people on the call don't know my reputation. I did lead the audit, the retail distribution review, when I was a director at the Financial Services Authority. So just in the interest of transparency. So I think there might be those who would have thought I'd have been going in saying, yes, we must apply the UK experience elsewhere in Europe. But I think Alexander will testify to the fact that nothing could be further from the truth. And that I was very clear that the structures of distribution in Europe, in the rest of Europe outside the UK, are very different from those that apply in the UK. And I was particularly concerned when I started. Again, it was one of those situations where I found myself sitting over Christmas writing a paper on the subject. You know, one of the arguments is that we really don't have enough data. about how distribution works in Europe. There was a general feeling that it's important to develop more third-party distribution around Europe. How do you apply inducements when it comes to in-house products and in-house advice? There is definitely, there is no doubt that an advice gap has developed in the UK. So, we were not able to say we want to stop any discussion of inducements. And this is a debate which is going to continue. And we as IFARMA will no doubt need to engage in that debate. But I think it's something on which we need a lot more information actually about. I started the debate in thinking about this, thinking I'll go away and try and find out how much distribution in Europe is third party and how much of it is in-house. And there is no such data. So that's one of the reasons why the proposal is that ESMA do more work on actually understanding distribution in Europe.
And there's also this recommendation that additional work be carried out concerning the impact of inducement on the quality of advice. I mean, do you have any specific expectations from that new work stream?
I think there is going to be a willingness. I mean, that was one of the other things that we were constantly saying, look, you've got existing provisions in the legislation, in MiFID, in the context of greater supervisory convergence. You do need to think about having more coherence around Europe about what you mean around quality of advice, the quality of enhancing the quality of the service, and so on.
Sheila, we have a question, Alex, also on PRIPS. Huh? So I think there is a reference to recommendations to PRIPS, to the review, to the need to clarify whatever needs to be clarified ahead of the application of the PRIPS kit to the UCITS kit. I mean, do you think it is a game changer? Will it put additional pressure on the Commission to carry out a proper level 1 review, or this is just a pie in the sky, as you say in the UK?
Quite frankly, I mean, this was a topic where there was broad consensus among at least our subgroup members, with all the consumer finance representatives as well as other stakeholders, in particular with regard to past performance presentations in the PRIPS kit. But as you all know, more recently in those discussions with the Commission and the Parliament, this has not really been brought to the table. I mean, in that respect, the Commission is I think, not following any advice from the high-level forum, but also from discussions and recommendations by ESMA and other stakeholders in this context.
And I mean, think
yeah, please, Sheila.
There are some loud voices in the Parliament. I don't know if you've yet had a chance to look at it, but Isabel Benumea has produced the draft report, the draft own initiative report. And in there, she makes reference to PRIPS and the need to respect level 1 in particular in relation to performance scenarios. So, I just think the more this is another pressure point, but I'm not sure that it's going to be a game changer as far as the thinking is concerned. We just need to keep up the pressure.
Thank you. What about pensions? I mean, pensions are not really within the remit of the ECOFIN Council. Typically those are not finance ministers. I mean, and we know that you, as members of the forum, you have promoted this idea of getting a buy-in at the highest possible level, at the level of European Council, and not of the ECOFIN only. Are you optimistic that any progress will be made in the pension space, occupational and personal pensions? I think everyone agrees that there is a need.
Yes.
But apart from that, is there political will? It is so sensitive in so many countries.
Yeah.
I mean, will your report be just yet another report, or will it make a difference?
Well, I think there are some, I mean, I think we were all very well aware of the politics around this, which is why some of the proposals are in the form of dashboards. So it's not saying to member states, you must have a multi-pillared pension system, but it's almost enabling them to compare themselves with their peers and apply sort of moral pressure, moral suasion on them. I think that was why we took the approach that we did. And also in helping the reason why we were talking about pensions dashboards, not just in terms of member states and the sustainability of their pension schemes, but also why we were looking at individuals. So enabling individuals to realize, I'm going to have an impoverished old age if I don't do something about this sooner. So trying to get the pressure from both sides.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we're running a bit out of time. What I suggest is maybe I will give you, each of you, maybe 2 minutes to make a kind of final comments, and then I will wrap up and we will conclude. Who wants to start? Alex? Any final comments?
Yeah, I think everybody, not only those in the call, but I think the representatives of the asset management industry in Europe should try to promote the recommendations of the high-level forum with their supervisors, with politicians, etc. I think it requires us a kind of joint effort to make this happen, this CMU 2.0. Otherwise, we are going to see another not only high-level forum in 5 years' time, but we are running out of time with regard to many of the proposals. So I can only invite everybody to support the recommendations, and that would be very much welcome from my end.
Thank you. Sheila?
I mean, I think my comment is, is all our hard work going to be worthwhile? And is it, this is advice to the Commission. So the Commission could just say, thank you very much, put it in its bottom drawer and go away. I think my first comment is that the very existence of the group and a group of sort of, experts and quite senior people have put quite a lot of time and effort into this. So they've got an investment which they will want to make sure produces some value. So I think, you've got a bunch of champions with the 28 of us, and we're not going to sit there and let it be put in a bottom drawer.
Thank you, Sheila. Ed?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, thank you for your questions. It's interesting to hear them because they were, remarkably similar questions that were asked, within the discussions that we had. I'd echo, Alex and Sheila's point around the importance of, if not now, then when. It's a critical juncture for global economies, but also the European project. And we started to see, again, a month ago, I think people would have thought things like further fiscal integration has been something that's perceived as too difficult. And so I do think that we are in a why not moment. My sort of last thought is that I've done far less of these things than Alex and Sheila have, so I'm kind of bushy-tailed and naturally optimistic about these being sort of taken up, which I'm sort of constantly reminded not to be as optimistic of. But I do think that even when we put such a heterogeneous group together, we were in violent agreement into a lot of these recommendations. So I can only assume that if a group can build consensus this easily, then I should think it shouldn't be as difficult to build consensus amongst the political organizations.
Thank you, Ed. I think time is up. I will not try to summarize anything. Just to say that, we are most grateful to all three of you for taking the time. So thank you all. Thank you to all of you participants. In terms of next steps, there is an ongoing consultation by the Commission on the report, ending at the end of June. It is available. It's an online consultation, so we will certainly, as a FAMA, comment on the report by the 30th of June deadline, but also, of course, we will be engaging not only with the Commission, but also with the Parliament and the Member States. I think, Sheila, you mentioned this own initiative report. There is an opportunity to engage with the MEPs on that in the coming weeks and months. And clearly, so much work needs to be done at national level. This is also one of the key messages of the high-level forum. I think the Commission is convinced. The Commission is fully behind the CMU and has been since September 2015. The issue is much more to be found at national level, and there we really need, collectively, at corporate, national, and national association level, to step up our game and to keep engaging and to keep making the point, including on taxations, which is not something we discussed at length today due to a lack of time. And also some of you were mentioning that maybe not much has been said in the report about the Giovannini barriers. So, but again, this is maybe something for another webinar. Let me just close this webinar, thanking you all again, and inviting you to be in touch with the EFAMA staff on all those issues. It is critical that we get very robust comments and input from the membership. So thank you all, stay safe, and speak soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.